The badge scanner beeped red for the third time, and Liam Webb didn't react at all. He simply stepped aside, out of the flow of foot traffic, and waited near the potted fig tree by the elevator bank, the way he always did when something didn't work the first time. Around him, the atrium of Haldon Tower buzzed with the particular electricity of a company about to unveil something it believed would change the world. Caterers moved between islands of white orchids. A production crew tested a spotlight that swept the ceiling like a searchlight. And in the center of it all, on a stage flanked by two enormous screens, still dark, stood a podium with a single word etched into glass behind it: Lumen. Liam wore gray coveralls with a faded logo stitched over the breast pocket, the kind of uniform that made people's eyes slide past him without ever quite landing. In one hand he carried a rolling cart with cleaning supplies. In the other, tucked into his palm where no one could see it, he carried a phone that had received 4 minutes earlier a single text message from a number saved only as a string of digits, asterisk there, announcing it tonight. Without you? Without credit? Are you going to let them? Asterisk, he hadn't answered yet. He was still deciding. A young woman in a sharp navy blazer approached the registration table near him, scanning a clipboard, murmuring instructions to an assistant trailing half a step behind her. Her name badge read Preston Kane VP, Product Strategy. Though the badge was actually a mistake, Preston Kane was a man, and this was his assistant, wearing his spare badge because her own hadn't printed in time. She would fix it later. Right now, nothing mattered except that the room felt flawless by 7 o'clock. "Excuse me," she said, not quite looking at Liam, the way people speak to furniture that has unexpectedly moved. "We need this area completely clear before guests arrive. Can you finish up somewhere else?" "Of course," Liam said. His voice was low, unhurried, carrying the particular calm of a man who had said far harder things to far angrier rooms. He began wheeling his cart toward the service corridor, and she added, catching something in his badge. A temporary contractor pass clipped crookedly to his collar. "Make sure you're gone by the time Mr. Kane does his walkthrough. He doesn't like seeing staff during setup. Makes him nervous." Liam nodded once, the kind of nod that could mean anything, and disappeared through a service door that most of the 200 guests arriving that evening would never notice existed. Behind that door, in a narrow hallway lit by a single humming fluorescent tube, he stopped. He set down the cart. He looked at his own reflection in the dark glass of a fire extinguisher case, a tired man in his 50s. Hair more silver than not, hands rough in the particular way of someone who had done physical work for a long stretch of years, though not his whole life. He looked, in other words, exactly like what his badge said he was. He was not that. 3 weeks earlier, none of this had existed. 3 weeks earlier, Liam Webb had walked through the front doors of Haldon Technologies for the first time as a temporary facilities contractor, carrying nothing but a duffel bag, a single house key on a ring with no other keys attached to it. And a decision he had made after 11 years of near total silence. He was going to see, with his own eyes, what had become of the thing he built. His daughter Anna, 16 years old and sharper than he gave himself credit for raising her to be, had asked him only one question before he left that morning. "Dad, why don't you just call them? Tell them who you are. Walk in the front door as yourself." He had knelt to tie his boots, an old habit from a life that had nothing to do with boardrooms, and said, "Because if I walk in as myself, everyone will show me the company they want me to see. I want to see the one that actually exists." She hadn't argued. She rarely did. Not because she was passive, but because she had learned over the years that her father's quiet decisions were usually the right ones, even when they took the long way around. What none of the 200 guests arriving that night for the Lumen launch understood, what not even Preston Kane understood, despite having built an entire quarter of self-congratulation around the product, was that 11 years earlier, in a garage that smelled permanently of solder and burnt coffee, a younger, sharper-eyed Liam Webb had written the first working prototype of the exact algorithm that now sat gutted and renamed and repackaged at the center of tonight's presentation. He had founded Haldon Technologies. He had built its foundational architecture with his own hands during the 2 years after his wife died, when work was the only thing that kept him from drowning. When Anna was a toddler and he brought her to the office in a portable crib because there was no one else to watch her, he had hired the first 30 employees personally, had slept on the office floor more nights than he could count, had built something real. And then, when Anna was 4 and diagnosed with a heart condition that required 2 surgeries and 18 months of intensive treatment, He had done the only thing a father in his position could do. He stepped back completely. He signed over operational control to a board he trusted, kept his equity silent and structured through a private holding entity that bore no trace of his name, and disappeared from public life to sit beside a hospital bed instead of a boardroom table. The company had grown in his absence, grown enormous. In fact, under new leadership that included a young, ambitious hire named Preston Kane, who had joined for years into Liam's absence and risen with the specific, gleaming confidence of a man who had never once considered that the ground beneath him might have a history he didn't know. Liam had never planned to come back at all. He had built a quiet life with Anna, now recovered, now thriving, now the reason he still bothered to get up some mornings. But 6 weeks ago, a former colleague, one of the original 30, a woman named Grace Okafor, who still worked in engineering and had never forgotten who had actually built the thing they all now took credit for, had reached out through a channel so old and quiet it had taken Liam a full day to remember the encryption key. Her message had been short. Asterisk, they're about to bury the safety architecture you designed. They're calling it a legacy system and stripping it out to hit a launch date. People are going to get hurt if this ships the way it's shipping. I don't know who else to tell. Asterisk, that was the moment Liam Webb decided to become, for 3 weeks, a man in gray coveralls who nobody looked at twice. The office itself, once he began moving through it daily with a mop and a badge that unlocked almost nothing important, revealed itself slowly, the way a house reveals its cracks once you've lived in it a while. Halden Technologies had grown into an open-plan complex of glass offices and standing desks and a rooftop garden that had cost, Liam would later learn, more than the company's entire first-year budget once had. There was a hierarchy to the place that had nothing to do with an org chart and everything to do with who Preston Kane smiled at in the hallway. Preston Kane, 38, was not a cartoon of ambition. That would have been easier to dismiss. He was, instead, precisely the kind of executive that companies mistake for visionary, articulate in meetings. Generous with praise when praise cost him nothing, ruthless in the small, deniable ways that never showed up in a performance review. He had built his reputation over 4 years on the back of a product he had not invented, refining its edges, renaming its components, presenting incremental improvements as revolutionary leaps, and doing it all with a smile that made board members feel important simply for being in the room with him. Liam watched him for 3 weeks the way an engineer studies a system before deciding whether it's salvageable. He watched Preston take credit in a Monday leadership sync for a fraud detection improvement that had actually come from a junior data scientist named Daniel Reyes, who sat 2 rows from the window and said nothing when Preston presented the work as his own, because Daniel had learned the hard way. 8 months earlier, that objecting to Preston Kane in a room full of Preston Kane's allies was a fast way to find your projects quietly reassigned. He watched a young HR coordinator named Priya Anand file a formal complaint about a pattern of dismissive, demeaning comments. Preston made toward junior staff comments, always delivered with just enough plausible deniability to survive an investigation, only to watch that complaint disappear into a drawer, because Preston's numbers were good, and good numbers bought silence in rooms where silence was cheap and truth was expensive. He watched, most importantly, as engineers under enormous, unreasonable pressure began stripping the safety verification layer out of LUMEN's fraud detection core. The layer, Liam himself had designed specifically to prevent false accusations from cascading into automatic account freezes without human review, because Preston had promised the board a launch date that the original careful architecture could not meet. He said nothing. For 3 weeks, he emptied trash cans. He wiped down conference tables after meetings, where his own name was spoken, unknowingly, by people discussing the original founder. Like a ghost story, he listened. He watched Grace Okafor's careful, worried eyes track him across the office. On the 2 occasions, their paths crossed. The only person in the building who knew exactly who he was and had the discipline not to show it. And every night, he went home to anime dinner, helped with homework, and said nothing about the day at all, because there was nothing yet worth saying. He was still gathering, still confirming. A man who had once built systems for a living knew that outrage without evidence was just noise, and noise never won. The small humiliations accumulated the way water finds cracks in stone, not through force, but through persistence. There was the morning Preston, walking briskly through the break room with 2 junior staffers trailing him like satellites. glanced at Liam refilling the coffee machine, and said, without breaking stride, "Careful with that thing. It's older than some of the people who work here," a joke that got the requisite laugh from the satellites, and that Liam absorbed without any visible reaction at all, though the machine, as it happened, was not old. It had been installed 18 months earlier, a detail Preston hadn't bothered to know, because knowing details about people who cleaned up after him had simply never occurred to him as necessary. There was the afternoon, a facilities manager, new and anxious to impress, snapped at Liam in front of a dozen employees for using the wrong elevator bank during a VIP transition, making him wait 15 minutes in a stairwell so a group of investors wouldn't have to share elevator space with someone in coveralls. Liam stood in that stairwell without complaint and thought distantly of the elevator he had personally chosen the manufacturer for, back when the building was still an empty shell and he was the only person who cared what it would eventually become. There was the evening Preston hosting an impromptu happy hour for the leadership team in the very atrium where the launch would eventually be staged. Saw Liam wiping down a nearby table and said, loudly enough for the room to hear, "You know, my old man used to say, the fastest way to see how someone treats people is to watch how they treat the janitor." And then, without a trace of irony, without a flicker of self-awareness, turned back to his drink and never once considered how he himself was scoring on his own father's test. Liam filed all of it away, not for revenge, though a lesser man might have called it that, but for evidence, because he had learned, over a long career of quiet observation, that the people who cause the most damage rarely do it in one dramatic act. They do it in 1,000 small ones, each deniable, each survivable on its own. And the only way to hold them accountable was to stop looking at the small ones individually and start looking at the pattern. Grace Okafor helped him build that pattern. Late one evening, 3 days before the Lumen launch, she found him in the server room on the pretense of a maintenance request and handed him a flash drive without a word. Internal emails, safety review documents with Preston's handwritten dismissals in the margins not a launch blocker, revisit postcard, legal says acceptable risk, and a spreadsheet Daniel Reyes had quietly maintained for months, tracking every instance his work had been presented under someone else's name. "There's more," Grace said quietly, glancing once toward the hallway. Priya's complaint. HR buried it, but she kept a copy. "If you're really going to do something about this, you should talk to her." "I will," Liam said. "Thank you for trusting me with this." Grace studied him for a long moment, the way someone studies a person they haven't seen in over a decade and are still adjusting to seeing again. "I never stopped believing you'd come back if it mattered enough," she said. "I just didn't think it would take a fraud detection failure to do it." "It's not just the failure," Liam said. "It's what building something and then watching people who never understood why you built it decide it's theirs to hollow out." That night, he made the call that set the final phase in motion, not to Preston, not to the board, but to a compliance attorney he had kept on retainer under a shell entity for exactly this kind of contingency. A woman named Vanessa Cho who had represented his interests silently for a decade without ever once needing to act. He gave her everything: the stripped safety layer, the credit theft pattern, the buried HR complaint, the launch timeline that put profit ahead of the exact kind of consumer harm his original architecture had been built to prevent. "Do you want to stop the launch?" Vanessa asked. "Or do you want to walk back in as yourself?" Liam considered the question longer than she expected. "Both," he finally said. "But I want the room to understand why, before I ever say a word," which brought him back to the atrium on launch night. Standing in a service corridor in gray coveralls, holding a phone with an unanswered text still glowing on the screen, asterisk, "Are you going to let them?" Asterisk, while beyond the door, 200 guests gathered under white orchids to watch Preston Kane take credit, one final time, for something he had never built and had nearly broken. At 7:15, the lights dimmed. Preston walked onto the stage in a tailored charcoal suit, radiant with the particular confidence of a man who has never once been wrong in a room full of people paid to agree with him. He spoke about vision. He spoke about innovation. He spoke about the founder's original dream, gesturing vaguely at a slide with an old, blurred photograph of the garage where Halden Technologies had actually begun. A photograph, Liam noted, was something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, that Preston had clearly never bothered to ask anyone about, because if he had, he would have known that the man in the photograph, barely visible, soldering something at a workbench, was standing 40 feet away from him right now. Tonight, Preston said, voice rising with practiced cadence. "We don't just launch a product. We launch the next era of secure, intelligent finance, an era where fraud simply cannot slip through the cracks, because Lumen's detection engine has been engineered from the ground up for 100% reliability." It was, Liam knew with the specific, cold clarity of an engineer hearing a lie about his own work, the single most dangerous sentence Preston could have said. 100% reliability was not a claim the stripped-down architecture could support. It was a claim that would, within weeks of launch, generate exactly the kind of false positive account, freezes, and wrongful fraud flags that Liam's original human review layer had existed specifically to prevent, and it was a claim being made right now to investors, press, and 200 paying enterprise clients who would build real financial infrastructure on top of a promise that had been gutted for a deadline. Liam stepped out of the service corridor. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He walked, in his gray coveralls, directly toward the small technical booth at the side of the stage where a junior AV coordinator sat monitoring the presentation feed. A young woman who startled slightly when he approached and said, quietly, "I need 30 seconds on the house mic after this slide. I promise you it's authorized. Check with Grace Okafor if you need to. She'll confirm." The coordinator, trained to follow chains of authority she didn't always understand, radioed Grace, who answered in 4 words that would later be repeated in hushed tones throughout the company for months. "Give him the mic." Preston was 2 sentences into his closing remarks, something about changing finance for 1 billion users, when the house microphone at the edge of the stage clicked on, and a calm, unhurried voice cut cleanly across the atrium. Before anyone applauds, Liam said, "I'd like to correct one thing you just said." 200 heads turned. Preston's smile did not immediately fail, because for 1 full second, he genuinely could not process what he was looking at. A man in janitor's coveralls, standing at the edge of his stage, holding a second, smaller microphone the AV coordinator had just handed him, speaking into the room as though he had every right to. "Sir," Preston said, laughing slightly, playing to the room, "I think you might be in the wrong." "I'm not," Liam said. "I built the detection engine you just told 200 people is 100% reliable. I built it 11 years ago, in a garage 4 blocks from here. And I built it with a human review safeguard, specifically because no algorithm should ever be trusted to freeze someone's life savings without a person checking first. That safeguard was removed 6 weeks ago to meet tonight's date. I have the internal emails showing exactly who approved that decision and exactly what warnings were ignored to make it." The room had gone fully silent, the kind of silence that has weight. "I don't know who you," Preston started again, and this time his voice had lost its cadence entirely. "My name is Liam Webb," Liam said, and he said it the way a man says something he has not said aloud in 11 years, carefully, like setting down something heavy he'd been carrying a long distance. "I founded this company. I still hold controlling interest through Haldon Family Holdings, which some of you may recognize from your own cap table if you've ever actually read it closely. I have spent the last 3 weeks working in this building as a contractor because I wanted to see, honestly, what this company had become in my absence. I found some things I'm proud of. I found people doing careful, good work under enormous pressure, and I found a pattern of decisions made largely by the man standing 3 feet from me that prioritized his own advancement over both the safety of your users and the integrity of the people he manages." Somewhere near the back of the room, Daniel Reyes, who had spent 8 months swallowing credit theft in silence, put a hand over his mouth. Grace Okafor, standing near the technical booth, did not move at all, watching with the stillness of someone witnessing a debt finally being paid. Preston, to his credit, the only credit he would receive that night, did not try to physically stop what was happening. He simply stood, visibly recalculating an entire future, in real time, as Liam continued. "The launch tonight is postponed," Liam said. "Not cancelled, postponed, until the safety architecture is fully restored and independently verified, which I expect will take approximately 3 weeks. Every client in this room will receive a personal call from our compliance team within 48 hours explaining exactly why. Because I would rather lose 1 night of good press than let a single user's account get wrongly frozen because we hit a deadline instead of getting it right." He turned, finally, to look directly at Preston, and his voice, when it came, held no triumph in it at all, only the tired, exact weight of a man closing a chapter he'd never wanted to have to reopen. "You're placed on immediate administrative leave, effective now. Pending a full independent review of the safety decisions on this project and a formal HR investigation into a complaint filed by Priya Anand 5 months ago that was never properly escalated. Both will be conducted by outside counsel, not internal staff, so no one in this room needs to worry about their job security for telling the truth during it. The applause, when it eventually came not for Preston, but for the strange, quiet dignity of the moment, for the sense that something crooked had just been set straight, was not loud. It was the kind of applause that starts uncertainly and grows only as people realize they're allowed to feel what they're feeling. Liam didn't wait for it to build. He set the microphone down gently on the edge of the stage and walked off into the wings, past a stunned production crew, back toward the service corridor where his cleaning cart still sat, exactly where he'd left it 15 minutes earlier. The investigation that followed over the next 3 weeks moved with the unglamorous, meticulous pace of real accountability rather than dramatic reckoning. Vanessa Cho's outside legal team reviewed every email Preston had sent regarding the safety layer removal and found in writing his own acknowledgement that the change increased false positive risk within acceptable limits for launch, a phrase that would later be read aloud, without embellishment, in a board meeting that ended with his formal resignation rather than force it into a messier termination. Daniel Reyes's credit theft documentation, corroborated by 4 other engineers who came forward once they understood the company would actually protect them for doing so, resulted in Preston losing his industry standing at 2 other companies who quietly rescinded advisory offers once the story became known in tighter professional circles. Priya Anand's 5-month-old complaint, finally investigated by an outside firm with no incentive to protect Preston, was substantiated in full and became the basis for a new company-wide policy placed on every HR complaint in external reviewer, with insisted on every ever reviewer, employer reviewer ablover or abover and bover plored, and bon bao by point by wadi kun por, prower, prop ka corn por, with sip couple and sev and on at pro and to the whole qua how and well went all to I still and secure to da hoa with no exceptions and no drawer left to bury it in. Liam did not fire everyone who had ever laughed at Preston's jokes, or looked past Liam in the hallway. He understood in a way that made him a better leader than vengeance ever could have, that most people had simply been navigating a culture someone else had built, and that the job now was to build a different one, not to punish people for surviving the old one. The facilities manager who'd once made him wait in a stairwell apologized, unprompted, the week after the launch, having pieced together who he'd actually been speaking to. Liam told her simply, "You were doing your job as it was explained to you. The job was the problem, not you," and meant it. He restored the safety verification layer himself over those 3 weeks, working late in the same server room where Grace had once handed him a flash drive in silence, teaching to junior engineers, Daniel among them, the original architecture in a level of detail no documentation had ever fully captured, because he had built it in his own hands and remembered every decision behind every line. Lumen relaunched 5 weeks later, quietly, without an atrium full of orchids, or a stage or a spotlight. Just an email to enterprise clients explaining exactly what had changed and why, signed not by a VP of product strategy, but by the company's founder, whose name most of them were hearing correctly for the first time. It performed, in its first quarter, exactly as promised, not with impossible perfection, but with the honest, careful reliability of a system built by someone who had never stopped caring what happened to the people on the other end of it. On his last day working officially as facilities contractor Liam W., before his real office, his old office, cleared out and prepared without fanfare, was ready, he found, on the shelf above his temporary locker in the break room. The same chipped ceramic coffee mug he'd bought for the original office 11 years earlier. The one with a small, faded illustration of a lighthouse on its side, which he'd left behind the day he stepped back to sit beside Anna's hospital bed and had never expected to see again. Grace, it turned out, had kept it in a drawer at her desk for over a decade, unwilling to throw away the one physical object that still connected her to the company's actual beginning, waiting, without ever quite admitting it to herself, for a day she'd almost stopped believing would come. He held it for a long moment in the quiet break room, thinking about lighthouses, about the strange, specific purpose of a structure built not to stop the storm, but simply to keep shining steadily enough that the people navigating through it could find their way home. That evening, he told Anna the whole story over dinner, start to finish, for the first time in real detail rather than careful fragments. She listened without interrupting, the way she'd learned to from him, and when he finished, she didn't ask about the money, or the company, or even about Preston. She asked only one thing. "Are you glad you went back?" Liam thought about the lighthouse mug, now sitting on the counter beside the sink, and about a stairwell he'd once waited in without complaint, and about a quiet coordinator handing him a microphone because someone she trusted told her to. "I'm glad I went back quietly," he said. "If I'd walked in loud, I would have only ever seen what people wanted to show me. Going in quiet let me see what was actually true. And it turns out the truth was worth fixing." She smiled and reached for the mug, filling it with tea instead of coffee. Sliding it across the counter to him the way she had 100 times before, never once needing to know that it was, in its own small and unremarkable way, the exact shape of everything her father had spent his life trying to build. Something steady, something honest, something that had been there all along, waiting quietly for someone to notice it was worth protecting.